but today is going to be a little more casual. We're just talking about tanks. I didn't get to finish one of like the kind of damage spreadsheets that I wanted to show off because it just seemed to be getting too big and a little too complicated, and it just wouldn't be ready in time for me to fully go over. But I do have a few notes on paper to look at tanks and their functionality and for their build design to incorporate them. But like so far really all I have is like the standard tank push and why it's good, where to start setting up tanks, and then I'll even open up a game and just show little practice runs of how to kind of leapfrog. We'll talk about exact tank lines and where you should set up tank lines, but most of the tanks are map specific if you're doing kind of pushes. So we'll go over broad ideas, we'll talk about specific timings on some maps, or specific places on some maps, but it's kind of hard to talk about tanks without talking about placement of every single map. But yeah. What's really great about tanks is not only can you have tanks in a mech composition, you gotta have tanks in a bio composition for Terran. The most common, obviously, is the Marine tank, which was prevalent in so many TVZs, which is still prevalent. Marine tank is also extremely popular in the TVT matchup, and part of the infamous Banshee tank timing push is really the clump of Marines and the siege tanks, which makes it so effective, and the Banshees to poke around and do harassment when you're not killing the opponent. But we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the Banshee tank timing push replay established, so I'll probably just go over the basics of that build, even though technically on paper it doesn't work exactly. But it just works out. I know that sounded really complicated to say, but it's just how it is. But to kind of start off, what I'm going to show is a build that I essentially tell any aspiring Terran players to use, especially in a TVT, as it is a very annoying. Oh, did I even label it? Oh. Which is a very strong timing attack, which can destroy a lot of Terran openings. And so we're just loading up. I think I'm just doing this versus an easy computer. That's what I usually practice under, unless I'm starting to really get the refinement that I play under very hard, since the computer will always do like a really fast one-base push. And I'm just trying to see if the build can even withstand that before I take it to more human play, which usually plays more greedy and more diverse, I should say. But basically, the opening to this build is that 13 gas, which I talked about last week, a very standard opening. So we get the supply depot on 10, which we just threw down, barracks on 12, gas on 13. Really should have had a slide for this. Gas on 13. And then after the second supply depot is completed, which should be started at 17, that SCV builds the factory, and then it builds the second gas as fast as possible. And what makes this push actually so strong is the constant production of Marines. We're actually moving a little too fast, and we'll back up a little bit to talking a little bit about this kind of timing. So we started this supply depot at around the 17 supply mark if you're following that. We're constantly pumping out 3 Marines. We're actually going to get about 3 Marines, and then we're going to throw down a reactor. That's just how the timing works. Same basic, at 16 get the orbital command. As soon as the supply depot is done, we had just enough gas, to throw down this factory. As soon as this factory is complete, we're going to throw down a tech lab. And as you can see, we had a little time, but we were just a little time before the second gas went up, but that's because we didn't have enough minerals. And then, wow. As is a lot of information. I'm just going a little too fast and I'm playing at normal speed. So we're actually going to slow it way down in a second. So we're at about 60 gas right now and about 80 minerals. And so then we throw down the reactor because we have enough for it. And what we're going to do is this kind of marine tank timing push. So we have 3 marines. After the 3rd marine is complete, we build the reactor. If we got our 13 gas on time. As soon as this gas is complete, we already throw up to 3 guys on there to start mining away because we're going to need the gas to do the push appropriately, not approximately. It's actually 23, so this supply depot is second a little bit. Well, that's fine. As soon as this factory is complete, you build your tech lab. In this variation, we're doing the 3 siege tank push with an expansion afterwards. So we're not doing a starport in this variation. There are variations in which you get a medevac, get a Viking, or even the Banshee Kaiju pushes. As soon as this tech lab is complete, you start building the first siege tank. We don't start our just yet. We do that after we start our second siege tank. Why we do that is because this tank's costs are actually fairly high on gas compared to most of the other units, and we'll show a little example after this replay. And you just can't really afford it. And it also is the rule of thumb, which I talked about last week, in which you want more units rather than upgrade. So having 1 tank with siege upgrade is way less powerful than just having 3 tanks even without it. That's also true when you're ranking early tank lines. We had a union worker who's just constantly building supply facilities, so we're able to support constant SCV production, constant 2 marine production, and this tank. Again, I passed up. I'm going to actually scoot back. Scoot back even more. So this is actually, the first siege tank isn't even out yet. And I've already queued up the second one because I know that's where my gas is going to go, and I've already made my supply depots and everything is hunky-dory. So as soon as this finishes up, immediately, bam, I'm getting the siege tank research. Constantly making marines, constantly making SCVs, constantly making supply depots with this union worker. You can place these in different positions. They don't have to be in a straight line. I think I start zigzagging. It's just kind of what I do. And constantly dropping down the fuels to have a lot of minerals going on. So siege is actually going to come up and it finishes around the 7-minute 10 mark. It's 7:14 now. So if there was a push that was happening now, or if we were trying to buy time from a 4-gate, if we scouted it, we could have bunkered up instead of pumping out an additional supply depot. Of course, we might get supply capped for a split second or whatnot, but not dying is more important in that instance. So we're on the 7:10 mark, so if in your Terran notebook you can write this down as that's a really important time. And now we can decide to either move out right now, or because this 3rd siege tank is 3 seconds away, we're going to wait till the 3rd one is done, and then we're going to move out. And essentially we're still, as soon as this 3rd siege tank is out, we start moving out. So right now we have 14 marines and 3 siege tanks. Hopefully I do it in this example the whole time I'm back where I should. Then I can like command center wall out. That's the expansion part of this build. So I move it out. Usually on Zelnaga Caverns, I almost said temple, and that's not right. You start sieging up that here, and then you start poking units in. I was a little greedy in this example because I knew the computer didn't do that, and I just started to move in a little bit earlier. And this is when we're going to talk about leapfrogging in just a little bit. So instead I siege up here, because why I siege up here if the computer didn't move out just a little bit earlier and this siege tank was here, even if you try to have reinforcements run by, this would be in range of being picked off, at least from a single shell. And this is the start of the little leapfrog that I do in this build. Tanks here, it's up the ramp, they have to get out, and it's a little bit more so it's sitting on top of the ramp. Now this is really important, especially for even diamond and lower. If this one siege tank can hit any units that are just kind of sitting here, the natural AI is going to say, oh, I'm going to move down this ramp. And if they move down this ramp, these two siege tanks are then going to hit. So they're going to be like, oh, something hit me. And for that split second, it's going to take them about 1 to 2 seconds to move down. And if your opponent doesn't react, they're going to get hit 2 additional times by siege tanks. And then you have this marine kind of barrier. So your marines can start doing a lot of their DPS action. After this siege tank is in position, which has range on top of the ramp, I'm moving exactly 1 siege tank to poke. I thought that was funny. I move 1 marine up here to get vision to see exactly what's there, and that's when the shell goes off. Alternatively, this marine would have actually drawn fire if there were marines and marauders here and not in a bunker, in which then they would have started to chase this marine for all of these tanks to do damage. I should be having this position as like a little soft contain is actually really important, because we're getting this expansion following our push. That means we're just buying time, applying a little bit pressure, and all our remaining siege tanks marines, we're actually having them at home because we want to prevent any counter pushes that happen out. Since if our opponent, this is now 9 minutes in the game, that means a drop could have happened and then they go for a base race, and which can be really annoying. So if all these units were being rallied, it would have been, yes, a stronger attack, but we're not trying to win this game with this attack specifically. And so since we're expanding behind it, we don't need to win it right away, since all we want to do is gain that economic advantage. And this push should deny or really punish any fast expansion, since if they got a faster expand before their factory, they're not going to have their tank, or they shouldn't have their tanks ready while your tanks are setting up a position, and they may have even cut marine counts if you're in a TVT, for an example. So this is a very strong entry-level push. You're on gold and lower levels, you can win games outright just by doing this, even while playing defensive back at home and taking this expansion to do even more damage for a follow-up push. Follow-up pushes for a Banshee tank, for a tank marine kind of composition is just to get upgrades, get medevacs, and stay this marine tank composition. With marines and medevacs, you can start doing drops as another form of offense, or you can start creating the nasty siege tank lines of a literally string of siege tanks in siege mode, which can completely cut off a section of the map unless there's a big engagement going on. So that's just kind of the entry-level build that I wanted to go over. And we're actually now going to look at a little spreadsheet that I made on it. Not everyone does this. This is just something that I need to do to kind of conceptualize different builds and everything else. And so what I have here is I have 4 different squadrons of units, and these are all just Terran units, and you can see I have Zerg unit tab and a Protoss unit tab, in which I can start to kind of theory craft a build. And right now in our top left section we have the Terran units by the highest mineral counts. So shockingly, the battlecruiser is the most expensive unit at 400 minerals. But today we're looking at the tank. So just looking at the highest amount of minerals to make one tank, it's 150. That's rank 4th, tying the Banshee and the Viking, which are also 150 minerals. Oh, not there yet. Now, compared to the highest gas units, tanks are still ranked 4th, and they're actually not tied with anything. In the bottom 2 sections, we actually have the minerals per minute, like as if we're constantly making tanks. This is how many minerals it takes per minute to just have like one factory going at a certain time. And in the right section, we have the gas consumption, that if we're producing tanks constantly, that's how much that factory is using of our resources. And as we can see here, tanks are actually 5th place with our minerals, so they're relatively inexpensive compared to other things such as making reactor hellions, because if you do reactor hellions, this number is actually doubled, in which it's burning this number right here. This number is actually doubled to actually 400 per minute. And so we sit here at 200 per minute. That's because we had the equation of the cost of the unit, which is 150, times the it's called a product as well as the division. It's 60 seconds over the time it takes to create the tank. So 60 over 45 times 150, and that's how we get the 200 minerals per minute if we're making a single tank out of one factory non-stop. Now looking at the gas, tanks are actually a little bit more expensive. As we can see, the first 3 things are tied for first, and then it's tanks. So tanks are actually extremely gas heavy to do. At 166 gas per minute, one base can gather about 220 gas per minute. That means we cannot even support 2 factories on one base making tanks non-stop. If we try to do that, then we're actually going to have some times in which one factory is not doing anything, and that's not good. Another thing of getting 2 factories really fast on one base is you're probably not going to be able to squeeze out that siege research. Because if we squeeze out that siege research, that's actually eliminating nearly 1 tank. The research is actually cheaper than the tank itself. So if we go back to the rule of thumb, it would have actually been better to have an extra tank than that siege research. And at that point, you're doing a panzer push. A panzer, I like to call tanks that are just not sieged. After the German tanks, it just makes it that much easier rather than saying, well, was it a tank push or was it a siege tank push? Just strictly saying either tanks, I usually mean they have siege, and when I say panzers, they don't have siege. And so a common thing to actually break early game siege lines is to do a panzer push, in which you just move your tanks or panzers into the siege tanks or tanks, and then that's usually how you crush it, because the DPS, I try not to use that term too much, but the DPS is just a little bit higher early game without any of the +1 upgrades on the vehicle weapons. So this is just kind of a very basic breakdown of what I use, and each time on Terran It Up or really anything that I start talking about how we're going to do this build, I actually look at these raw numbers when I can, or if like I can't boot up Starcraft 2, it's extremely easy since I'm always in front of a computer and I can quickly just run numbers, make really fast equations, and I have all of these basics of the unit names, the timings, the costs of gas and minerals, all just memorized. That's something else that I thought is really important if you're learning a race, is to have, this is what I consider the basics memorized, and then you kind of build off of that. But the important part of doing the minerals per minute and gas per minute is you can start theory crafting what can I support on one base, what can I support on 2, 3 bases, and so on and so forth, as long as you start kind of doing multiples. On average, a single base can mine 800 minerals and 220 gas. I usually estimate 200 gas just to give me a little wiggle room, and that means if you're on 2 bases you have 1600 minerals and 400 gas. And so with that 400 gas, I could easily make 2 tanks at a time, and I can actually get away with just having 3 gas guys just going down if I know I'm just going to make tanks and just make marines, because marines cost 0 gas. So this is just something nice and little simple that I like to do, and kind of that I use on theory crafting, like the paperwork. And of course, because it's theory, it doesn't always translate into practical. So I showed you the push, and I showed you kind of the basic examples, the rankings of what the cost is if you just buy one, if you're building it continuously, or kind of build crafting, I guess at that point. It's kind of past theory crafting. Well, not past, but limited one. And so I didn't have a full example, ready to talk about the positioning of tanks, because it's a little tricky at times. So I'm just going to open up a very easy computer. I'll just set it to Terran, and I'm just going to do a very slow kind of push with tanks. I'm going to open up this 13 gas opening, and I'm just going to constantly make tanks. I'm going to take that early expansion, and I'm going to actually get
Bad news.
a second
Go ahead.
factory up, in which I'll start producing nothing but marine
Not enough
tanks.
minerals.
So
Not enough minerals.
So this is essentially
Not
the
enough
marine
minerals.
tank
Not enough
playstyle
minerals.
will go
SCV
to
ready.
places.
Not
Now,
enough
if you just
minerals.
go marine tanks, say,
Not enough
versus another
minerals.
Terran, you're going to actually have a lot of trouble.
Not
if
enough
they open up
minerals.
Banshees, since you're not getting that starport early on.
SCV ready.
Have the Vikings
Not enough minerals.
Stop any of that harassment, and if you delay too long to even get the engineering bay, you're not going to have any anti-air, especially when they start cloaking units. And you're
SCV ready.
going to lose a lot of SCVs and usually the game.
What's going on?
So my supply depot's a little late.
Yo.
Not enough minerals.
Scouting information.
SCV ready.
To tell
You're
you
the
about
bomb.
that patch, and hopefully he stays to it. But the whole point of playing this marine tank style is not to win the game.
Additional supply
It
depots
is
required.
a very scary early push of having all those marines and the siege tanks barreling in at your opponent. But why this is such an effective kind of build and push and composition is because it doesn't have to win right away.
SCV
it
ready.
has follow-ups, it has transitions, and the most important thing about those follow-ups and transitions is that it gets more bases, or at least 2 bases before the next really big.
What's going on?
This gas
SCV
is
ready.
late, since I got to talking so much. All I've been practicing recently are gases on 17.
In the rear
not
with the
because
gear.
I always forget gas, but
Ah,
I'm starting
you
to
scared
get
me.
much easier
SCV
to get
ready.
expansion out and
Well,
expand
butter
it.
'em up. Go ahead.
I sometimes
Good job.
early throw gas on gas, and I could use that
SCV ready.
to know that my gas is up and running. This is going. I'm actually going to throw this one.
Huh?
You don't need to have
We
your
hear
scout
ya.
in your opponent's base, especially
SCV
in Terran.
ready.
It's a little scary. You can base your marine, your barracks timing to see if
Go ahead.
when you need to retreat and when
Gangway
is
coming
pop
through.
out. But it can be very scary. If you're
In the rear with the gear.
Since my gas was a little late, this factory may be a little late.
Insufficient
Just by a
Vespine
little bit.
gas.
Like as soon as it got in this position, it should be 100
This better be
mineral,
good.
100 gas, I'm sorry. But by the time he moved over here, it's about at 90. So,
Upgrade complete.
I can tighten that up.
What's going on?
So the factory's down to another rule of thumb is to get that second gas. As soon as this third
Go,
goes
go,
out,
go.
start that reactor immediately.
SCV ready.
Constantly building SCVs. That's the entire point of what I consider to be a good build. I'm not at 22 supply yet. As soon as I hit 22 supply,
SCV ready.
grab one of my SCVs and start pumping out. Probably actually could have used that
SCV ready.
to go and start building supply depots, but that's not what I did. I didn't use too many
Add-on
of it, especially
complete.
Since we are getting,
Ah, you scared me. SCV ready.
a little more saturated. And so during my first push, I'm actually going to start sieging up around here.
SCV ready.
It's a
Armed
little
and
scary
ready.
to do sieging up on this wall, as it may seem a quote-unquote a little better, but their marines, marauders, and even their own siege tanks can start shelling us and do massive damages.
SCV ready.
Because we don't have vision up that wall.
Who wants some?
Not enough minerals.
Ready
So our first siege tank's out. Our second one is already in production. That means as soon as we have
Not enough minerals.
resources, bam, we get the siege tank done.
Go ahead.
And I'm gonna pause the game actually
Game
right here.
paused.
This is a good position. I thought I could move the screen around a little bit. But if you're playing against a Terran, if you're Protoss, if you're Zerg or whatever, and you are able to look at the 6-minute mark and either scan their base. I don't know if you can get an observer to their base that fast. I don't know that timing because I don't play TOS regularly. And even if you can then send an overlord real quick, you will probably lose it because at this point I think I have 8 Marines, or at least that's what my hotkey says, which will take it out. But if you're able to look into their base and spot they have a factory, it's researching something, which is signified by this little green bubbly shit. They're probably either getting blue flame really fast and doing a Marine Hellion kind of push, or they're going for this tank siege push, or even defense. Don't assume that they are going to attack you. Oh, my dog's up. But the more information that you can get, usually if you can spot the second gas, that usually means they're not going Hellions, because if they're not making siege tanks or another gas heavy unit, they're going to have so much gas, and that's actually wasted resources this early on in the game. They should have actually had those 3 SCVs mining minerals rather than mining that extra gas, which isn't even being used yet. But that's what, if you're going up against an opponent, 6-minute mark, that's actually key. So if you're doing a build, like building craft or theory crafting, usually having your build to scout around the 6-minute mark. If that's trying to sacrifice an SCV to the front, burning a scan, using an observer, scouting with a hallucinated phoenix, or even sacrificing an overlord or poking it with a circling, you're just trying to get that information. And of course, at the 6-minute mark, if you poke in just the front and all you see are roughly 8 Marines, and you can start practicing counting really fast the unit composition, you can assume that I've either built 2 naked Raxes, in which I'm pumping out Marines, or that I've built a reactor, and I'm building Marines out of that reactor. So that can give you also a little more information to see what I'm planning on doing. But without getting too much more into that, we're going to go on to the game.
Game resumed.
So, just queuing up a little bit of Marines, building Squad Eagles
Not enough minerals.
always, and just kind of cranking out the stuff.
Not insufficient vaccine gas.
So, this is the money tank right here. As soon as that is complete, we're going to be moving out.
Not enough minerals.
And I think if you try not to rely too much on your supply count while doing builds, especially since if you're handling an early aggression, it can screw up your mindset of just like, okay, I held off this Baneling bus type of thing. I'm at 20 supply. Wait, do I now get siege research now, or do I wait a little bit more? Just use it when you have the resources. As soon as this 3rd siege tank comes out, I'm moving out. I actually have... Why is this not feeling good? So I'm moving out with about 15 Marines and 3 siege tanks, and I'm constantly building additional Marines, additional SCVs, and additional tanks. Why I'm building additional SCVs is, since I'm a little oversaturated, is look at my mineral count. We're at about the 8-minute mark. We could have thrown that down a little bit more if I wasn't talking so much. But what we're going to do is then transfer about 8 of these, which is going to be a full row, to our natural to start our natural up really big. Because actually taking this natural expansion so late is a late expansion. And so we're actually going to siege up just 2 of these tanks right now. This is so we're completely defended. And then we're going to start poking in a little bit. And so now if this siege tank and these Marines spot anything, they'll take the shell first. And this is the other reason why we have units here. If they sent an entire, kind of attack force, these units should have been sieged. So that was a little bit blunder that I can work on, and I'm actually getting supply block right now. And I'm just going to throw down these 2 additional barracks to kind of even out my money a little bit. And I'm getting the barracks because I already know the unit composition I'm going for this entire game. During this whole entire time, probably just moving 1 siege tank would have been better. But we're just setting up this little bit contained and having them spread out, knowing that that I'm facing off against a Terran opponent, all their units are ranged, so and even against every race, just have your tanks spread out a little bit and to kind of create this concave. So even if they do break your line, it's extremely more difficult for your opponent to take out these tanks quickly. If they're all bunched up, all they have to do is stutter step and they start doing damage immediately, rather than having to actually move the units and take another shell or two before any of that happenings. Now with the barracks that just completed, I got a tech lab first, and then a reactor on that second barracks. Why I did that is I want to start getting my upgrades very fast. I usually upgrade combat shield first because I want my Marines just to stay alive longer, essentially. So that's the very basic line of thought. I queue up both of my supply depots to my new base, and now I'm transferring a little bit more than 8 because my command center has been done for a while. And both my command centers are now going to start saturating this kind of mineral patches. And now we have a lot of minerals that are being flooded into Marines, and we're actually going to throw down our second factory, and we're going to start getting this starport. The starport is going to complement our Marines by getting some medevacs and some more air control, since the big thing in the tank style play, and TVT especially, is getting a Viking count up and to have that air dominance. Macro slipping a little bit because number one, I'm not that great of a player, and number two, I'm talking while I'm playing, which is even worse. And whenever you can, look at the mini-map. This is already in a good kind of spread position, so it doesn't need too much kind of wonderment. At this time, it's so late, if they haven't taken expansion since you've been mining from your expansion for so long, that you should have way more units than them. I'm throwing down a tech lab or a reactor immediately on the starport to start pumping out either 2 medevacs at a time or 2 Vikings. And now my mineral count is actually really bad since I'm getting supply blocked. So we're actually going to... These are really late upgrades in my opinion. But that's alright. Another one, a little trick that I like to talk about, I'm actually doing 2 right now, which I want to comment on. I'm going to pause. Since now we're entering kind of the 2-base play, which for a lot more inexperienced players, and oh god, 600, that is awful. A lot of inexperienced players, this is when you start having that kind of what do I do kind of moment. And right now I'm just running on reaction of looking at the time, looking at my mineral count, and seeing what I can afford. And I know, oh god, we're at almost the 14-minute mark and I don't have any +1 upgrades. I'm so far behind there. I'm just starting my starport. I should be starting my stim, because that's the complement of having medevacs, and then you have your massive bio ball, in this example Marines, that are healed then by these medevacs after burning stim. So that's all just kind of reactionary things that I'm doing. It's just like, oh look, I have a starport that's getting a reactor up. Bam! I better have that stim already started as soon as that combat shield is done actually. And then these eBays, as soon as these are done, that's going to be, I know already, 200 minerals and 200 gas out of that. I'm going to start already producing 2 tanks at a time, so that's roughly 320 gas per minute just out of those 2 factories. So I'm actually for a little bit going to overproduce on gas, because I'm going to be pumping out 2 medevacs, two siege tanks, and then I'm also getting some upgrades all at the same time. Usually you can't produce all that, but in this example, since we're playing a little catch up, we can, and we're all gearing up for then our kind of follow-up or secondary push. Since I'm on 2 bases, I'm also should have at least 2 SCVs that are constantly being produced. Oh, I didn't comment on it. My hotkey 5, which is my supply depots, is also I queue up any of my researching buildings. So my academies, or armories, wrong game, my engineering bays, those all go onto my 5 key. Because no matter what, your supply depot, not your supply depots, but your command centers, your nexus, or really anything else, that will always default as your first thing, as you can see here, and then all your research is behind it. So I know if my +1s are constantly going every single time that I just tap in, and you should be making SCVs every 17 seconds, since that's how long SCVs take. And so every 17 seconds I'm making sure, am I actually upgrading, which is just a very good kind of mental checklist. Now during this whole time, not only am I setting up this massive kind of marine tank force, but I'm also should start now getting ready to expand. Why I'm getting ready to expand is because I'm nearly capped already, which means not necessarily that I should attack, but what's going to happen by the time this is done, I'm going to be capped. And it's not even going to be completely finished by the time I'm going to be capped. Since right now I'm just going to actually pause it right here. I have 3 barracks, which have 2 reactors, 1 tech lab, which has gotten both combat shield and stim. I have 2 factories producing tanks non-stop, and then I also have this starport, and the starport is to see if I'm going to make medevacs, which, if we don't scout anything, that's your kind of go-to unit. But if we're going up, say against Colossus play and a Protoss player, we need to start getting Vikings, and you should actually start considering even getting a second starport to make 4 Vikings out at a time. If we're going against a Terran player and our Viking count is high enough, a kind of good number that I like to have is 6, and then I stop there, and then based on what I scout, then I start making more Vikings. And when I'm not making Vikings, I'm making medevacs, is how easily that is. And then you're just constantly making whatever force in this composition, constant Marines and constant siege tanks, and then your starport is kind of secondary to all. The most fragile thing, which I haven't talked about in this composition, are your Marines, especially in a TVT. If your opponent is also doing kind of a Marine tank style, your Marines can die extremely fast. If you're not watching them for even a split second, they rush in, and then they get hit by all of these tanks. Even in this vicinity, we have 10 tanks. Without even upgrades, that's 35 damage to a Marine. So it takes 2 shells to kill these poor Marines. And now we're completely capped. We have 102 units, which is actually not too bad. We have oversaturation in our natural. We need to start. We have way oversaturation here. So as soon as our 3rd is done, we're actually going to lift this off, land it, and then we're going to transfer some workers to have a more efficient kind of mining base. I should have used my army to take out those rocks beforehand, but I mainly wanted to show of how scary this can kind of look. You should also consider, I didn't do it this game because I'm actually out of practice with it too, is to have your tanks on separate hotkey as the rest of your units. What I've been experimenting with is I have custom hotkeys in which my tilde button, which is right next to your 1, is actually hotkey to, I believe, my 7. So right now I'm doing control, it's actually to my 8. And so just to check my tanks real quick, I'm hitting my tilde. And so if I need to reposition all of these guys real quick, I can just do tilde unsiege or tilde siege, tilde move, or whatever, and then you should just have your Marines and medevacs on your 1. And so like these hotkeys are right next to each other. I can easily move these around like very quickly. And with some practice, you can even start stimming these units at some time. You can then start using slicing with your tanks, start selecting them all, doing all sorts of fun little tricks for siege tanks. Um, but I mean, essentially, this game has been over for a while. Another very important thing when relating to siege tanks is taking control of the towers. Siege tanks can control towers the best out of any unit, probably in Starcraft 2, because they have a range of 13 while sieged, and the Xel'Naga tower clearly gives enough vision for a siege tank to operate and just be sieged on this tower. And so literally, it doesn't matter if your opponent has complete air control of Vikings. The Vikings are going to be able to see this, but if they try to move, your opponent tries to move siege tanks out in your kind of territory, they're going to get shelled and die before they even siege up. And but a minus thing about it, especially on this map, if you're heavily fortified here, your opponents can just circumvent you by going around. That's the big downside of tanks. This is why usually you also have these Marines as your zoning unit. Of course, you can have a few by your main siege lines, just for a standard defense if they try to rush in at all, or if you're getting ready to unsiege. But mainly you can start using these Marines as strictly zoning their tanks or their army from doing any counter pressure, because even though that was a small force, they're not going to break this. But if they're going to try to run their own siege tanks, or even just like some stalkers or whatever, these Marines then zone your opponent as like kind of a little corral, or even think of them as like a herding dog. So you can start saying, no, don't go over here, this is completely fortified, and with this Marines here, it's even defending your third type of thing. Well, this is defending kind of the main avenue. Some also good things about doing the Marine tank medevac composition is you can actually start putting some siege tanks on the high ground if the map has that capability. So on Xel'Naga Caverns, it's also a really mean thing and fun thing to do to place your tanks either on these little ridges. There's nothing there. And so if you're going up against, say, like a Zerg opponent or even a Protoss opponent, I now have these units on the high ground, which they have to either have a Colossus, Phoenix, Void Ray, or an Observer type of thing to spot these tanks. And we should have some units here, either more tanks or some Marines, to control this watchtower, so we have just this massive control, and these tanks are nearly 100% safe. Versus Zerg, this can be a really mean tactic, unless the Zerg buddy is making a lot, and I mean a lot of mutas. Since the mutas fly in, they say, oh, these are completely free, and just shoot you, and just get shot. Against Terran players, if they try to rush in, this was like a Marine Marauder, even if the Marine Marauder stands right here, they're not going to do anything. There's no going to be any random splash damage to these tanks, and these tanks are going to just reign supreme. So looking for high ground is really important. Even if you're defending like a single push or even late game pushes, we can have these tanks to be up on the high ground for that same reason. They have to have some sort of flying unit to stop these tanks. But that's kind of the basics of what you can produce, and you saw for some moments in time that my minerals were absolutely gone. And same thing with my gas was gone, since once you start producing out of these two factories in Starport, that is a lot of gas consumption, and then the rest of your minerals are getting flooded into these barracks. In hindsight, I should have gotten these engineering bays earlier, but I didn't, so that was that. I'm actually going to let my dog out, because I'm sure everyone has heard that she's been barking for like the past 5 minutes. So I will be back in just a little bit, as soon as I hit the right button. Here we're going to continue on talking about tanks in this kind of episode 2 of Turn It Up. What screen do I open up? This one? No, this one. So this is just kind of the spreadsheet that I showed earlier. And what we're gonna go over now is we're gonna open up the unit testing station. which I also very, very, very much, yes, very much recommend by Super Ferret, evidently. Super Ferret Unit Test Map. This is my favorite one. I've used 3 of them. And this one is just like kind of the right size, and you can set up the right scenarios of trying to break units and so on and so forth. And also you can control both armies. Some you can't control both armies, which is a little weird, but this is what I like. So immediately we're just going to make a bunch of overlords, because that's like the only little glitch that I've found so far is you can't like actually max out on 200 army at the start. So we're going to just make a bunch of tanks, and for example we're going to also have some counter tanks or enemy tanks. And the first thing I want to show is a little earlier I talked about how 1 siege tank in siege mode is more useless than just 3 kind of panzers. And we're going to simply just look at this. Oh, I didn't actually research it. We're going to look at this kind of composition before we even actually do it. Marines, when you're kind of going up against a marine tank, Marines are essentially useless. All you need counts on really are tanks and Vikings. Those are the 2 most important things, and you can just then have like a mental image of, and there are Marines, because that's where all the money is usually getting flooded. Usually Terrans flood their money through Marines or Hellions, depending on what's going on. So right now we have 3 siege tanks that we decided to constantly produce 3 siege tanks constantly rather than getting this upgrade. And this is the example of someone getting siege research immediately as the tech lab finished and pumping out that siege tank, and by doing so delays the second siege tank to come out and everything else. And so right now we have 1 versus 3, but this has upgrades, and we're simply just going to move and got 1 shell off. Now of course in the real practice it's not going to go that easily, because there are going to be about equal number of Marines, and so we're actually going to recreate that. When I moved out I had roughly 15 Marines unupgraded, so we're going to make a bunch out of here, and then we're going to make a bunch out of here. And to get the numbers just right, we have 11 here, 4 more, that's 15. So we are going to have 15, and we're even going to spread them around a little nice. 15 in 1 siege tank versus 12, 13, 14, 15. 15 and 3 siege tanks. Oh. And so usually, in this scenario, I don't want the shells to go off just yet. Yeah, let's even just bunch them up for this example. And so it's going to take 2 shells out of this siege tank to kill these Marines, since they don't have stim, and the siege tank does 35 damage unupgraded. And then we have equal number of Marines, but 2 more tanks, but not the research. So we're just going to move, and we're going to take massive damage from not having this. We're going to stutter a little bit, target down this tank, which probably was the wrong kind of plan. And even by maybe not even doing that correctly, we walk away with still 2 of our tanks and 4 Marines. And so now we're just going to send these off. What do I usually do? I usually make 1 probe, and I have this kind of little kill station, as I like to think of them, in which simply you make just a ring of cannons. And any units that are partially damaged that I don't want, it does screw up the maximum supply, and so we just kind of kill them off. But in the meantime, when we're setting that up, we can produce a lot more Marines for this side and a lot more Marines for this side. To then run through this test again to see how even we don't need to pay attention to what's even really going on, and we should win that fight. So after I make a few cannons here, whatever, it'll go. We're gonna then take about 18, 15. How did I screw up that math so much? 14, 15. So we have 15 Marines, 3 siege tanks, all on one control group. And so now we have a little kill station in which all we do is do move commands and we circle it. And look at how awesome cannons are. So we have the 18 here, and now we have to set up 7, 13, and 2 more. And the one actually sieged. Now we can do this in many different variations. Before I had the Marines kind of split out for this opponent. This time I'm even going to have the Marines out in front of a little bit. And we're going to then A-move the Marines and tanks with absolutely 0 micro and see what happens. This is a rarely good occasion. I'm not going to try to single out that siege tank, and I'm just going to A-move these Marines and tanks into this position to see what happens. Not touching a thing yet. And now we had the 3 tanks versus 1 tank. So our Marines traded, and we have 0 damage on our siege tanks. This is why getting units is far more important than getting that tech. 100%. And it's another reason why it's not really important to count the Marines. We can even start increasing their Marine count versus ours by like a few. Say if they should have defender's advantage. So it takes about, we'll give them 4 more Marines this time. And we're going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to literally just A-move. I was a little more intent of watching because I wasn't 100% sure of what was going to happen. But I'm going to just sit here like this because you can't see my keyboard. But you can see my hands. I'm not doing a damn micro thing of like kill this Marine, then kill this Marine, run past, kill that tank. I'm just going to sit here and show. So instead of having 15 Marines for this time, oh, that was an awesome split. We're going to have 19. Because 15 plus 4, last time I checked, is 19. And then 1 siege tank and siege position. We're also going to split out these Marines a little bit to make a scarier wall, and even have a little bit of spacing. So we already have kind of a concave. And so this is actually a very scary thing to look at. This is just a massive messy wall that has the 15 Marines and 3 siege tanks. I'm now going to A-move behind this ramp, in which these units are going to charge willy-nilly into this concave with this siege tank. And we're going to see what happens. Ready, go! So even with the defenders, oh, he's starting to attack these tanks. So even with the defender's advantage, I wish I stopped those guys before they ran into their impending doom. But I think we had roughly 5 Marines and 1 siege tank after that, with the defender's advantage. So at this point, the only thing we can really work on, testing to see if getting that 1 siege tank in siege mode on the high ground, so we're going to position all this on the high ground, and then we're going to 1A this opposing side to see if we can even break up a wall. You would normally never do this because I already have a feeling we're going to lose this engagement. But I just want to see how badly, mainly. So we have 15 here and 3 siege tanks. We're actually going to have to move all these guys. Alright, and now we're going to have 18, we'll make it 19. And then 1 tank that hasn't been injured. We're actually going to have the siege tank a little bit behind, same thing, so the 1A team is going to have to break up, and we're going to create this very scary little line. And so this siege tank is actually going to start shelling before we even break it. All these Marines are going to be in range. This is a very scary thing to charge into, in which in a normal game I completely condone not rushing into this. Why is this guy stuck? But here we go. This team is going to 1A, past that tank. We have 15 Marines versus 19, but 3 tanks without siege versus 1 siege tank with siege. Let's find out this outcome. And again, just get in position. Get in position. And that's the only kind of confrontation in which the siege tank will win. As we saw in the open ground, even with awesome concaves and everything else, it loses out, but it's only this position in which you never ever do. You never ever really run up a ramp with siege tanks behind it. Even one, as we saw how scary it is, because the units are going to clump up, which means it's going to maximize the amount of splash damage that goes around. And having even this kind of concave of Marines, in which there's 13 Marines left, that was a huge win for them because of the vision and everything else. Even if I try to stutter step even a little bit, there was so many free hits that this team received that it wasn't even going to matter. So this is all about positioning. So you can defend it. And this tells us actually important information that we can defend, or should defend, a tank push that's coming even if we start our siege tanks late. And if we start our siege tanks late, it may not be that bad of an idea to get siege right away. A big example is if we opened up like a 4 racks rush. If we opened up a 4 racks rush, or let's do something less convoluted. If we open up racks fast expansion, that usually sets our factory behind by about 40 to 80 seconds, we'll say. I think on average it's 50 in my practice, but 40 to 80 seconds. That means roughly 2 rounds of Marines we've missed. That's 1 less tank completely. And so best case scenario, we would have 2 siege tanks with siege versus 3 siege tanks, and we would actually be behind on the Marine count by about 4 Marines, so we would actually have defender's advantage with Marines. It would be about 15 Marines versus 15 Marines, except 3 siege tanks with siege versus 2 siege tanks with siege, but we have an expansion if they were doing just that pure build. Now if they added in Banshees, that's a problem. But yeah, we can look at this defender's advantage, but if we're in this defending position in a TVT and they start setting up their tanks lines here, now it's a lot like chess, of how you have pawns and all like 3 moves ahead to target a single square. That becomes this ramp. The ramp then becomes that kind of critical unit, which is usually in the chessboard, like in the E5 or D5 area. And if you don't know what that means, it's the spaces that are right in front of the pawns, in front of the queen and the king, as soon as the pawn, 3 spaces in front of the pawns. Yeah, 3 spaces in front of the pawns. and you literally start creating these chess matches in which, am I going to move my siege tanks or not? Am I really going to try to fight for this position or not? Am I going to move away these Marines, which are effectively knights or bishops in this example, which then all I have here are kind of the pawns, which are stuck in these one position. We may be able to move up a little bit, but then we're stuck here. Rather than these more fast moving units. I like bishops in this example. But it's all about positioning. If you're stuck in this defender's advantage and you took an early CC, you're probably not going to be mining from it. And you're going to have to try to figure out a way how to break this by either getting drop shifts to drop your units more on the low ground and just kind of work with that defender's advantage, or exactly what, or get an air dominance and literally just start inching this tank more and more and more and more to take away their tanks, and as soon as their tanks are gone, then you unsiege and you A-move like we showed in that open field example. Oh, those are your own. But use that kind of scenario or this unit test maker to figure out what you can actually do with those 3 siege tanks or whatnot. Not only in TVT, but in the other matchups. But like, you kind of have to know the timings of when you're gonna have the 3 siege tanks or 1 siege tank or whatnot. So like, this becomes a little more tricky, but you can even just say like, okay, can I just have 2 siege tanks and then I throw 8 stalkers? What happens? And then later on, when you start getting more refined in your kind of ability or anything else, then you can start doing more trickier things. And the best thing that the unit testing station does is to test like A-move armies of like, if I just A-move this group and I didn't pay attention to it, what's the worst that can happen? I'm actually just curious. So I want this tank alive, and we're gonna sacrifice these. In which let's take about 10, yeah, 13 seems fine. So we have 13 Marines and 1 siege tank versus 8 stalkers, and see what happens. Same again, this is like the best scenario for the siege tank, and we're gonna actually, and let's give them 2 sentries. Why not? Crap, they don't start. I wanted to actually do the Guardian Shield. But let's just rush up with a little bit of micro to get a little bit more advantage to see what happens. Yeah. So there's about 5 Marines left. If we had the Guardian Shield, you could probably break that really easily. Since then the Marines would start doing just 4 damage a piece, and then the Stalkers I think have 1 armor. Yeah, so this shot is lowered down to 4, and then armor is lowered down another 1, so they start doing 3 apiece. That literally, well, cuts it in half, which is disgusting. But you can work on different things of exactly what unit compositions you can get away with, or like when you actually feel safe. I mean, just even that 1 tank was really safe. If I had 2, I would feel, oh my god, safe. And by safe, I mean this position, if they try to break it, I own it. And like a little bit space afterwards, I have some properties of. The biggest trick in TVT, the tank lines, even though I'm controlling both of these lines, you can click on your opponent's siege tanks and you will still see this line. And so what a lot of times happens, this should work. Yeah. So it's actually, the siege tank's vision is a little off. So I want to position these two siege tanks to get in range of these tanks, and then I'm going to use a scan essentially to grant vision to do damage. I have these selected or even just one selected, and I'm going to remember this, and I'm going to siege on the, oh, this side doesn't have siege. I'm going to move up and then siege immediately, move up, siege immediately, and I'm sitting actually on the line. As soon as these are completely sieged, what I'm going to do with this side is scan. And now this side has vision in which these two siege tanks are going to take out all 4 of these tanks with 0 damage. And then as soon as that scan wears off again, we can then just simply unsiege, move up on the line again, siege up, and then, oop, I'm hitting hotkeys, think I'm actually playing. And then, bam, scan again. These 2 siege tanks, using the kind of click trick, just took out 4 siege tanks. Alternatively to scans, I talked about using Vikings, because controlling air is extremely important, not only in TV, well, the most probably in TVT, because in the other matchups you have to control their air a little bit more. You usually don't, well, in Protoss you make Vikings as well to stop Colossus and Void Rays if they go that route. Or, but usually in TVZ you have to just stick with Marines and Thors to control their airspace. So you don't counter their air with air, you counter their air with ground that shoots air. But you can work on even then the basic skills of moving up siege tank lines and picking off. You can then start doing little time challenges that you set yourself. I don't know a really good trainer that practices pushing up sieges. But if you want to work on a little bit more micro, I have one more example practice to show you. Or at least I hope so. I haven't done this one in a while. The build order test zone, it's actually bad placement of minerals, but like you can easily just type in like enter Z enter and then it resets. So if you screw something up and you really just want to establish like the first 5 minutes of your game, which I talked so important about on Thursday, I believe. Was it Thursday? No, it was the last Terran up. You can just work on 5 minutes and like you look at the clock and then Z, and then you start all over again as soon as the clock reaches 5, Z or T type of thing, and just keep practicing. Marine Split Challenge, highly recommend for Marines, but that's not what this episode really was about. What I wanted was, and I'm not seeing it anymore. Is it this one? I think it's this one. So it's Darglin's Micro Trainer, created by Swordfish. Oh god, I've been going for over an hour. So this is going to be the last thing, and then Turn It Up is done. Well, I guess I did stop for 5 minutes, but we've still been going over an hour. That just makes editing the video even more fun for me when I post it up on YouTube, which everyone who's watching should subscribe to. I'm at On My Face on YouTube. My Twitter's, I think, just at On My Face. The only thing that's different is my Gmail, which is onmyface.tv@gmail.com. So this trainer has all sorts of micro trainers for all the races in different scenarios. The one that I want to focus on is this tank bust. Why this is kind of fun? Not necessarily you working on tanks. I thought we had tanks as well. I may have been thinking of a different one. But you can start upping the challenges and so on and so forth. But this is just teaching if you wanted to do more of a biocentric force of how you actually needed to engage a tank line. And just like I said, you can't select multiples, but you can select one. And if I had a tank, I could just put it right here, scan, and then just start shelling them. Or if I had Vikings, it would show vision, and then I would start shelling them. But in this example, I just spread out a little bit, and I'm just going to A move, and you can kind of figure out what you need to do if you need to send in just like spare Marines to begin with or whatnot. This is actually an easy one, but now we have even more tanks, and we're actually going to move up. And I think this trainer actually gets to like near impossible levels, and it actually shows army value limits. So your starting composition shouldn't change, it's only your opponent's that changes. So now, just showing the exact same strategy which I did before of just making a line of bio and rushing in, probably is going to fail horribly. So we boxed everything, and we're just going to A move. And these tanks are just going to rip through, or should rip through everything. Oh god, I think I almost broke it. I did break it. Okay, so I guess I made it to level 7 with actually trying to fail. But anyway, that's just another way. If you're looking to beat tanks, you can do that. Oh crap, I'm actually going to open that up again, because I think for each of the races there was something that you can do to help try to break that tank line, not just the Terran one. So there was the 3 categories, and I just clicked on the Terran one, the tank bus, and hopefully with the remaining one, base defense. Nope, I'm actually not seeing it, so I guess you can only practice the TVT tank bus with bio, or you can set up the examples in the first kind of training device, the unit testing map. But that's essentially all that I had today. I mean, I went over my little spreadsheet of trying to figure out builds of what you can afford per base and everything else, and usually tank plays are really anything that's high 6 or higher, I would say, on this list. You have to revolve your build around gas. If you weren't revolving your build around gas, you're going to start getting bottlenecked because of these gas units, and you're either going to have a huge influx of gas at weird points or a huge influx at minerals at weird point. We talked about the basic 13 gas, 3 tank timing push, which is still strong today. Like, that is the standard of standards in Terran in nearly every race, and it's scary in every single race. Right now, if you're really worried about the metagame and you're doing a TVZ, the standard thing right now is to open up Reactor Hellions. So what a lot of Zergs do actually is to get fast roaches and a few spine crawlers. So what's really effective versus roaches and spine crawlers? Tanks. The tanks outrange the spine crawlers majorly, and so that forces them to move, in which then the Marines can move in. And if they do splash damage and extra damage to roaches, instead of the 35, they start to do 50 damage, and roaches have 140 health, so 3 shells, 3 tanks, equals 1 dead roach per shot, and then splash damage. You can even then just panzer the tanks in certain scenarios, and it still beats the roaches. In panzer mode, it's 15 damage to a normal unit, and then 25 damage per second, essentially, to an armored unit. In TVZ or TVP, using that early tank push is really scary at containing a Protoss, and if they've done an early expansion, you can usually really punish them, because usually early expanding tosses use sentries that force field units out, like force field that 3 racks or force field any of that early shenanigans. But usually in tank play, the force fields help, because what will happen is the tanks, as we saw in that Zelnaga example, you siege the siege tanks before you even approach them, and then you start lunging forward. So as soon as the sentries or any other unit starts getting in range to start throwing down those force fields, you're already having 1 to 3 tanks shelling their units before they even throw the force fields down. So you'll actually eliminate a few of their forces before there's even an engagement, an exchange. And then, of course, in TVT, which I've talked about a lot today, if they're not ready to stop tanks, they're going to die. Some examples of stopping the tanks are doing the defensive tanks using positioning, but you can then fall into that trap because you're falling into a defense position. Your opponent then sets up a little contain, doesn't sacrifice his army, and then he expands behind it. And so, as we talked about in triangularity, if your opponent sets up a defense, then you power up by either teching or getting that expansion. In this case, grabbing that expansion and feeling really safe about it. So how to stop the tanks is to do tanks yourself, to get banshees with cloak. That takes a little more finesse. To even then get a couple Hellions out and engage that army on open field, the tank army on open field, to eliminate the Marines, which are the key parts, and then hopefully to either get close to the tanks if they're already sieged, or you just follow up with more Marines of your own to eliminate the remaining tanks. Those are kind of the quick and easy. It's really hard to hold off Marine tank with just pure Marines unupgraded early on. Later on in the game, you can start doing Marine Marauder bombs, which you take a medevac and you literally drop Marines and Marauders in a line of the tank line. So all of the enemy tanks shoot your units, but they do splash damage to their own tanks. And so effectively, you're using their units against them. Sure, you're losing Marines and Marauders, but tanks are they take longer to produce. They cost a shit ton more than your Marines and Marauders. So it's like a huge trade. And that's why a lot of tank armies like to have a high Viking count to stop that type of play. For your Zerg buddies, later on we'll get mutas. That means you have to increase your Marine count, essentially, get medevacs, and usually even get a few Thors to keep your main army alive. Versus Protosses, I'm still a little iffy with this. You have to be able to have siege tanks, but they can't be a replacement to Vikings. You need to have Vikings in there, since if they do get enough Colossus or even Immortals, the Immortals can do a lot of damage to them. And so you need a good composition of Marines, tanks, and then Vikings in TVT and TVP. But I'm actually going to stop it right now. Thanks for tuning in. I'll be loading this up on YouTube very shortly, and if you can, subscribe to me on YouTube. I'm AWMAFACE, AWMAFACE, and then same thing with Twitter, at Twitter. And then if you have any recommendations for Terran It Up or Theorycraft Thursday or questions in general, you can email me at AWMAFACETV, that's AWMAFACE TV@gmail.com. And I'll either answer those questions through email or I'll just talk about it on the show. But thanks again. This was a recommendation by someone from the Purdue Starcraft Club. So hopefully you enjoyed the show, and if you have any questions, feel free to talk to me. See you guys next time.